When you start sewing, there are a million things you don't know, and they don't even come written in books. You just have to learn them as you start sewing. But let's go ahead and let's skip steps, and I'm going to give you 50 pieces of advice that any beginner should know before starting sewing. Your fabric has grain, cross grain and bias. The grain is the meters you get at the fabric shop. I mean, it's the parallel line to the selvage edge, and it's the one that stretches the least. Then cross grain is the horizontal line, it stretches a bit more, and it's the width of the roll of fabric you get. And then the bias is the diagonal, which is the stretchiest bit. So you have to place your patterns on the grain generally, so they don't stretch and they don't adopt strange postures. Your measuring tape must never be rolled. Some of them bring a little hole in which you can hang them, and if not, for example, I have it here in my half Marie Antoinette now. But you never roll it because it stretches, loses shape, and then you end up measuring wrong. And apart from changing it from every once in a while, if you use it a lot, don't roll it. More things with the measuring tape. If you want to measure a curve, just put the measuring tape on its side. It's flexible for that reason, so you can measure everything. So that way, for example, if you want to measure a neckline or maybe an armhole to make sure that the sleeve is going to measure right, you just place it like this and you'll measure it properly. No problem at all. Your fabric scissors are only meant to cut fabric, so don't waste them on cutting a zip or paper because they lose their shape. They can get you can damage the blade. So just keep your scissors for fabric, and you can have other cheap ones for other things, but just keep them safe. If it's the first time you've got yourself a pattern magazine, don't just cut the pattern paper as it is with your size, because you'll ruin it. This brings all the patterns in the magazine, it's loads of them, so don't just cut it. Use some of this paper so you can trace the pattern on this and keep it as well, and then you can keep tracing. If not, you'll ruin the whole magazine. And if you notice that your scissors are not cutting very well, you can sharpen them with a bottle. If you have a bottle by hand, try cutting it and it gets the blade really sharp again. But this only works with normal scissors, of course. With your pinking shears, because it has those edges, you'll need aluminum paper. It works really well as well. And if you're starting, you don't need to get a really expensive sewing machine. One of these economic ones are really good. They are quite strong, they resist a lot, and it's just what you need to start fixing some clothes, mending, transforming, upcycling, and doing your first projects. You have to remember to clean and oil your sewing machine, depending on how often you use it. But you must not forget, all the thread going around in circles inside the sewing machine generates lots of dust and lint that accumulates, and that makes it go slower and even noisier, so it's not good for it. So just clean it, don't forget it, and oil it as well. Sometimes it's quite difficult to thread the sewing machine, you're tired, or you don't really get to the little hole. And a subscriber told me years ago that the machine has a sticker behind just for it, so you can see and you can know where the hole is. The reverse lever is really useful because it secures your seam. If you don't press it, your seam will open. It's like a little knot, like if you made a knot by hand, but on the machine, so make sure you do it. And when you finish your seam, make sure you use the reverse lever again, so your seam doesn't open on the back. Threading the sewing machine is quite easy because it has all the steps with numbers and arrows. That way you don't miss any step and you don't get knots or the seam doesn't look wobbly because it wasn't threaded properly. And another important thing as well is to thread your bobbin properly and to place it how the brand tells you to. In this case, the brand says to thread it, to put it not clockwise, but the other way around. So be careful on how you place it so you avoid, again, knots. And another interesting thing, apart from the machine's tension, from your thread tension, is the bobbin tension. The bobbin has a little screw here on the side, and you need to make sure about the tension so you avoid, again, knots. So you need to be able to hold your bobbin from the thread so it doesn't go down all the way, but if you strike it, it will. So it has to be able to give you enough thread, but to be tense as well. And if you're going to sew a corner, you don't need to sew it separately, two seams one after the other. You just can sew it all together. If you leave your needle in and you put the foot presser up, you can turn your fabric and go on sewing on the other side without any problems at all. It's much easier and efficient. And if your sewing machine is not sewing right, try things. Don't just look at it and pull your hairs out. Just try to do something. Try to thread it again. If that doesn't work, try to change the thread. Maybe it's not right. If that doesn't work, try to change the needle because maybe it's not working fine again because it's lost the sharpness. And if that doesn't work, try the tension as well. Try different things until it works because it usually does. Pinking shears are a really good investment because it allows you to hem nicely fabrics that are really fraying. Smells amazing. Fabrics need to be washed before you use them, not only because of hygiene, but because they shrink. Especially all the natural fabrics, all the cottons and linens are going to keep shrinking. So you better wash them before you sew something with them or they won't fit. And apart from washing, you need to iron your fabric before you cut it. It's just logical. If your fabric is not flat enough, you cut your pattern wrong. The seams won't be aligned and then it probably be too wide or it'll be twisted when you try it on. So just make sure you iron your fabric quite flat before cutting your pattern. And apart from ironing your fabric before starting, you're going to need to keep pressing your seams while you make them so they are flat enough so when you sew the next panel it's perfectly sewn and you don't get any wrinkles or anything out of balance. And I know all of this pressing is a bit exhausting because it's a bit of a nuisance having to sew something, press the seam, sew another thing, press the seam. So try to be efficient so you save electricity as well. If you sew a few things at once, then you can press those seams all at once. For example, if you're making a dress, you can sew the sleeves, the side seams of the bodice and the skirt together and then press all that. And that way, not even you save electricity, but you sew really quickly as well. And another useful thing to do with your iron is to press your hemlines before sewing them. That way they'll be really flat, you don't have to use any pins or you don't have to baste it. So you just press it really well and it'll be ready, it'll be really flat and you won't have any problems because it's not going to move anywhere. And of course, one thing we use the iron for is to press or to iron our interfacing. Interfacing is this fabric that brings, I don't know what this is, that brings glue on one side and, well, in some cases in both, like this one. And you put it into things that need a bit more consistency, for example, facings or waistbands. So for that you press it and it sticks really well, but the problem is that sometimes the glue comes on the sticks to the iron, and then it will stain anything you iron after. So for that you need to have by hand a piece of cloth that is maybe bedding that you don't use anymore, or a piece of remnant, a piece of scrap that from another project, something white, simple, that is not going to trespass colors either, so it's good to have. Pins are really useful, of course. You hold your fabric together when cutting it, and you can even sew straight ahead with them without the need of basting. Basting is such a nuisance. I hate basting, so this is a saving tip. But don't use pins if you're sewing faux leather or plastic, because the holes are going to stay there forever and ever. It's not like fabric that is weaved, so you already have holes in which the pins are getting into. This is just flat, it's thick, and it has no way back. So once you pin it, it's going to stay there forever. So use, instead of pins, some even paper clips you can use to hold it together. It won't damage it, and it works just fine. It's true that I always say that I hate basting. It takes a lot of time. I don't mean that it's a waste of time, because things when they're basted are better because you're making sure everything fits properly and you are doing the job properly. But it takes a lot of time. You're making the same job, you're doing the same job twice, because you're basting by hand, which takes longer, and then you're going to the machine. So I don't like it, but I do baste when it's something special, when I'm working with fabrics that move a lot maybe, or when I'm doing something special like placing something in between layers, like I'll say the name at some point. A ribbon or a crocheted lace, something like that, I do baste, because that won't be held by anything, even pins. It won't matter how many pins you put, it's going to move. So you better do it instead of sewing like crazy and doing a bad job. Patterns have to be placed right. I mean, if you're going to cut a sleeve, for example, you can place it on the grain, cross grain, or bias, whatever you're going to do, but properly. You can just place one like this and the other one like this because you forgot, or you didn't realize, or you're going to make the most of your fabric because it's going to twist. This is what happens when you buy something from a shop and you think, why does this shirt keep twisting and moving and doesn't stay in place? It's because of that. It wasn't cut properly. So place your patterns properly so everything looks fine. And don't forget to leave your seam allowance. If you don't, it'll be tight, it won't fit you. So remember that when you cut a pattern, this is the pattern. And if you start sewing, you're taking room from the pattern that you're not going to get back. So cut an extra centimeter, depending on the fabric you're going to use. If it's a thicker fabric, you need more seam allowance, so it eases better. So that way you won't lose it. It happened to me, it happened to all of us, but try to remember seam allowance. And when you finish cutting, in these little pieces is where you're going to try the tension. You need to try it before you start sewing anyways, because it's really difficult to advise, well, you need to use this tension with this fabric. Sometimes they change. So just make sure it doesn't take anything. So you just need to try in a little piece. And all these little pieces that are waste, really, can be used for something. Don't just throw them away. Even if it's a bit of elastic band, a bit of bias tape that has no use at all, no purpose in life, can be kept to fill in cushions. Of course, if you have something bigger, you can use it for little projects like making a sunglasses case or something like that. but the little bits are good for filling cushions, filling your pink cushion, for example, or like those ones I made. The shell cushions are all filled with little scraps of fabric, and it's quite heavy. So because it's quite heavy, I think it'll be good for a doorstop. I'm going to make one soon. So I'm keeping all my bits. We use everything. Fun fact, if you're starting sewing, we call it the seam ripper, but in reality it was made to open buttonholes. Whether you use it as a seam ripper or as an opener for buttonholes, it's really dangerous and you can even stab yourself with it. So 2 little tips: if you use it as an seam ripper, be careful and make sure you use it on the side that is protected. If not, you can rip not only your seam but your fabric as well. And if you use it as a buttonhole opener, try to place pins in each side at the end of the buttonhole. So that way it gets just there and you don't end up ripping the whole of the thing. What color thread to use? I always use one a bit darker than the fabric I'm using, because the lighter one is going to be more noticeable while the darker one not. So try that, and if you have a pattern fabric, try to use the one that is more prominent, the one that repeats the most, or the one in the background. And if not, you can even try to be a bit more fun and use someone that is makes a contrast. Sometimes I do that and it's quite good. If you're going to sew some knits or some elastic fabrics, don't use the normal stitch, because it's going to rip. The minute you force it a little bit, it's going to rip apart. Use the zigzag stitch or the zigzag that is parted, that is in 3 parts. That's really useful. It stretches just fine and you won't have any problems with it. Save yourself some time by having twice the tools. For example, 2 pairs of scissors, 2 pairs of seam rippers, and pins everywhere. Have some on your cutting table and on your sewing table, and that way you don't have to get up all the time looking for scissors and looking for things you need around. And it might seem little, but you end up saving loads of trips. And this might seem like something logical to say or to think, but be patient and don't be hard on yourself. Everything is going to be not right, like nothing is going to fit properly or to suit nicely, but once you get the hang of it, like everything, practice makes perfect. So just stick to it, just keep practicing. It's true that at first you're going to ruin some fabrics, but try to buy cheap fabrics or fabrics that are on offer, or little remnants that your fabric shop has around, so you don't end up wasting a lot of money in fabrics. But just be patient. But if pattern magazines aren't your thing, you can just start by cloning your own clothes and making sure that something you're going to sew is easy to do and it suits you perfectly. You just have to trace outside your pattern, your piece of clothing, and then recreate that pattern in a similar fabric, of course. If you have a stretchy fabric, get one, and if you have a flat, a plain fabric, get one as well. So that way you start sewing and you don't feel the pressure of all these lines. And the same with something you're going to get rid of because it's broken or damaged. Take the pattern before throwing it away, and that way you can recreate it at any time. And what needle to use? I always use my 9014 needle for normal fabrics. It's for cottons and it's a medium weight. And then I have different needles for lighter and thicker fabrics, because a thin needle won't sew the thicker fabric, and a thicker needle will damage your thin fabric. So you have to adapt depending on what you're going to sew. And I always say that tools are not a waste of money, but an investment. You need to invest in good tools to get good results. If you're going to get a cheap pair of scissors, they're not going to last you as long, but a good pair will. So try to think of that, and the same with foot presses. For example, try to get a useful few that are going to be forever with you. For example, you need an invisible zip one, a normal zip one, and something extra, for example, that you know you're going to use. If you like ruffles, maybe you need a gathering foot or something like that. So try to think of what you saw the most and try to make your life easier by getting that tool. And one thing I'm a fan of is mending and upcycling. You learn a lot from these two things. When you're starting sewing, you might think that it's boring, that it has no use, mending a hem or changing a zip. It has no use at all for me. Yes, it does, because you learn how it's sewn and in which order you need to sew something. So it's really useful. So try to mend something, try to upcycle something, and you learn a lot from it. And when we make a mistake, it's true that it's a nuisance to start picking the thread and taking the seam out. I really like my little embroidery scissors for doing that, because I feel I'm more secure that I'm not going to rip anything. Like with the seam ripper, I'm a bit afraid of it. So, but what I'm going to talk about, try not to rip the seam. Try not to hold both sides and rip it apart, because you can end up ripping the whole of the fabric. So that is that's just it has no solution. So try not to do that and be patient. And because we say fabric scissors are just for fabric, try to have a bad quality pair of scissors. Why? Because you'll need it to cut things that are not fabric. If you have an extra bit of zip, you need to get rid of. If you have some ribbon or some thick cord or something else to put in your projects, try to do it with another pair of scissors so you don't damage the good ones. I did once and they had like a step that the bottle got rid of. Good thing. But try to have a few pair of scissors for different things. And I think with that, it's all of my little tips. It's something you don't get in books, like you don't get when you are learning. You get it by sewing. You learn these things by making mistakes, and what we're trying to do is that you avoid those mistakes and you try to be a bit more efficient. Some things I've learned myself, some things I've learned because some subscribers have told me, but it's something you learn by talking to people or by doing yourself. So with this, I hope I've helped you by sewing more efficiently, or so you can do things in a better way. And if you like this kind of content, consider subscribing, because I upload twice a week, and I'll see you next week. I leave you a link with all the sewing tips here, and if you feel free, this is all a bit out of order, isn't it, this goodbye. And I'll leave you a link to my Instagram account and everything. So I'll see you around next week. I'm going to drink some water. Uy, qué bien huele. A limpito.